one of these times and spaces I will call the class, and I'm going to include the lab and clinic here any time when you and your students are together physically in the same place at the same time. Then I'm going to say that we have student preparation time. They may work together or singly, whatever. But you're not there. Then we have teacher, what I call teacher alone time. And I'm further going to propose that there are several aspects to learning. One is what I call first exposure. That's when the student first meets a new clinical procedure, new information, new ideas, new concepts, a new mathematical concept, whatever. And this is then the next one is called process. We want the student to apply it, critique it, argue with it, analyze it, use it in dealing with clients, whatever it is. And then there is response by teacher or peers to the student's attempt to do the process. Okay? Now, in the traditional model, first exposure is done in the classroom because the teacher is locked into the lecture box because the students have not prepared. So you are lecturing stuff to them that they have not met before, and they are trying as hard as they can to get it down accurately, often without much success. Then you make an assignment. You assign homework problems in math or physics. You assign them a computer project. You assign them an essay. You tell them there's going to be a test. So the process in which they're asked to synthesize, analyze, and argue is done in their own time, supposedly. Then they either bring this stuff in, or you give the class hour over to an essay test or something like that, or a multiple choice test. And then the response happens by you, friends, in your teacher alone time. You are no longer alone. You have all these papers with you. That's the traditional model. There's a lot wrong with it. Let me propose a new model in which, see if I can put the circles on the same page. No, I want to start a new page. Easier to see. See, we have a new model where we have the class, we have the student, we have the teacher, and now, first exposure, in Jack's system, the student does first exposure on his or her own time by reading the book and writing to prepare for class. Then the class is process. And the class is response. In this model, the teacher does not take home all of those pieces of writing in order to write extensively over them. The teacher may take them home to check that they've been done. But this does not increase your teaching load. In fact, for me, it has reduced it or kept it the same. Because the class time can be the response in this interactive model. Now let's talk a little bit about how this would work for a physics class, for example, which I have observed. This guy was spending a lot of time in class lecturing about physics and demonstrating how to solve problems at the board or on the overhead. And the students would try their best to take all this down, writing as fast as they could. He would keep trying to get questions from them. He'd say, "Are you getting it?" Stares. "Are there any questions?" Well, sometimes, but usually not, because you know what? It's not their fault. They're trying so hard to get all this stuff down that he's lecturing that they don't have really time to formulate questions, or else they think they understand it when they hear him talking about it and see him solve the problem. They say, "Oh, yeah, I understand this." Then at the end of the class, he says, all right, your homework for tonight is to do problems 7, 8, and 9 on page 121. They go home, 2 a.m. They crack open the book to page 121. They start in on question 7. Then what happens? Yeah, they fall asleep. They figure out that they didn't understand it after all. Then they know the questions to ask. But you're not there. I hope you are home asleep yourself, or you're up still but preparing for your next lecture, right? You're home preparing for the next lecture. They're there in their own rooms all by themselves, demonstrating vividly how much of a failure your other lecture just has been. When they come to class, they hand you their homework, and if it gets corrected by you in your teacher alone time. So this guy says to himself, how can I get out of this? Well, in a workshop, his colleague said to him, well, Howard, can you use the same strategy Jack uses? Can you have the students read the physics book before they come to class, make sure they do some written preparation for it, and then build on that in the class? And he said, you know, the students that I get here cannot read a physics book. Any physics book that I've ever seen, my students can't read. You cannot simply give them a physics book and say, read these pages and solve the problems. They need to see me in the real-time process of walking my way through a problem, solving it, and explaining why I did this and why I did this and why I did this. They need that performance piece of it. So now let me ask you. This guy is doing a performance of how to solve a physics problem. His students can't really get it from the book. Is there some way, nonetheless, that he can move this first exposure out of his class and into the student alone time? What is it? Videotape. Of course. Videotape. A book is not the only frozen medium that we have to freeze a performance. A book is a frozen medium. Students can use it anywhere at any time. I don't want to call it frozen so much perhaps as time independent. It is time and space independent to some extent anyway. So what Howard did was to have a student come in. You're not going to see him on the Academy Awards. This is not a slick production. But he had a student come in with a video cam, point it at him on the board, and then he demonstrated how to solve these physics problems and talked his way through it. Now he put the tape in the media center in the library and in the physics library at his school, and he required students to see the tape in the out-of-class time. So now he's no longer lecturing in the class these basic how to solve it kinds of physics things. What is he doing in the class? Evaluating how well they've learned it by their homework. Now they do their homework in the class. The problem with the old system is that they were trying to do the homework, the process, the hard part, home alone, as the movie says, without him there. And he was spending all his class time giving them the first exposure, but at the point of first exposure, they didn't know how to use the interactive potential of the class time because they didn't know what questions to ask. When you need activity is in the hard part. So now they watch the tape outside of class, and in class they do their homework. So he'll say to them, to class, bring your book, and when the class starts, he says, all right, you all saw the tape. Any questions about the tape? Well, sometimes there are, sometimes not. Then he says, all right, get in your groups, and they're in groups of 3. Homework problem number 7 on page 121. Turn to it, start in, and they start. Now, one good thing is that people in the groups teach each other. But if the whole group is confused, they raise their hands, and Howard is there to say, well, let's see how far you got. Oh, yeah, see, here's where you went astray. Here's what you... So he can set them straight. You see that that class was exactly flip-flopped between process and first exposure. Psych class, 100 students. How thick are psych books these days? 101. Psych 101, how thick is the book? Oh, 3, 4 inches. What do they cost? 60 bucks? Yeah. You make a student buy the book that thick. You walk in to teach Psych 101. There are students here who are going on into health and mental health professions. They're going on into further psych courses. They need this stuff. You know they need this stuff. And you feel that you've got to go through as much of that stuff in that book as you possibly can. So the semester becomes a race. And what's happening in psychology today is they're adding stuff just as fast as they can and not necessarily taking it out the bottom end. So what you have to cover is more and more and more and more and more and more. Well, she was frustrated because all she was doing in class was lecture this first exposure material. The students would not always read the book before they came, and then she would use some of her class time to test this material. Tests were always disappointing, and she never had fun to do the stuff that social scientists really do, which is to hypothesize, which is to observe through psychological lens, which is to play with data, to ask questions. Never had any time for that. We got to get this stuff covered. What did she do? She said to herself, how can I move that basic material into student alone time, even in a nearly open admission situation, which is what she was in. So she said to them, I've chosen the best intro psych class that I know that will be within the reach of most of you in terms of reading. And she said, here is a study guide that will help you through this text. Tells you what's most important, what you can skip, where to skim, where to concentrate, what you'll be responsible for. Use it. Then she said, there are going to be 8 tests over this material, multiple choice. And you will take the tests in room such and such, and here are the hours when the room is open and you can take the tests. Nowadays, you could probably do this on the computer. The students could take the test on the computer and send it to you. Then she said, you must attempt test 1 by September 20. You must attempt test 2 by October 3, test 3 by and so on. So that by September 20, everyone in the class had attempted test 1. If they passed it at the 85% level or above, they were on their way. Fine, no problem. If they fell below 85% on the test, they had one more chance to take it again, and they must do so within the following week. If at the end of the course a student had passed at 85% or above all 8 of the tests, she or he got an A for that portion of the grade. If you did 7 tests, if you passed 7 tests, you got a B. 6 tests was a C, and so on. You get the system? Now, she has moved this basic concepts, facts about psych and vocabulary outside into the student's own time. They're studying the book for a change, and they're taking the tests on it. Now, what does she do in class? She's more than 100 students. What does she do in class? She doesn't lecture the book. What does she do? She still figures out ways, even though there's 100 and more class, she still figures out ways to have them interactive. For example, she'll have them come into class and she'll say, take out a piece of paper. You've all attempted the test on such and such. Write down 3 questions that you have about this material. Pick those up. Even if you then lecture, at least you're basing your lecture on the students' questions that they've generated from studying the material. You're not just lecturing the basic stuff to them anymore. Or she'll take a data set. Let's say she has some data from somebody who observed people walking along the platform of a subway in New York City. And the question was, by gender and by race, how close do they come to each other as they pass on the subway station, on the subway platform, or something like that. She gives them this data. She might say, okay, get together, even if the seats are bolted, at least you can have pairs. Turn to your neighbor. Write down 2 things that you think you could reasonably conclude from this data in response to the question that has been posed. Now she might say, would this pair please do it on a transparency, and would this pair please do it on transparency, and would this pair? The rest of you just do it on a piece of scratch paper. Now, they get that done. She picks up the transparency. She puts it on the screen. And she's got student work to talk about. So she may show all three of the transparencies and say, what are the similarities and what are the differences among what these three groups did? Or does anyone have something different than appeared on any of these? Or which of these do you think is most defensible in terms of a conclusion drawn from this data? Now she might say, all right, the next thing I want you to do is to turn to your neighbor on the other side and generate 2 questions that you think this data would lead to. What data would you collect next? Where would the field go from here in answering these questions? Something like that. You got it? Another thing she does is some exercises in which they explore their own reactions. So she'll do this, there are 6 people in a boat. The boat is sinking. One of them has to go overboard. You have a psychologist. You have a baker. You have a computer specialist. Who are you going to toss overboard? That kind of thing. And then they talk about the dynamics in a psychological way. Another thing that she may do is to help them with their papers. Again, you're moving process into the class time. Bring your draft of your paper. Exchange it with your neighbor. Here is a check sheet, or take the check sheet I've already given you, better yet. Take the check sheet I've already given you. Give each other a response on these issues in your papers. If there are any questions, raise your hand. I'll come over and help with the response. So there are lots of things you can do, friends, even in a 100-person class, to keep that class interactive and to get students engaged in doing the activities of the discipline, not just listen to you lecture the basic stuff. And that's what this teacher tried to do. Questions, comments?
I think I know some of the answers, but part of the problem I run into is students who are so caught up in the old paradigm that they don't know how to make the shift. I do a similar thing with quizzes. That it's a performance quiz. Use these 5 techniques sentences to change the paragraph. Do one in class time. Grade it. Give it back. If you're not satisfied with the grade, you can take the second one. What happens with a fair number of students is they take the second one without having. They get the feedback, right? They get the response that says that they still don't understand this stuff and they can't apply it yet, and they'll take the second quiz hoping to do better.
Yes.
Hoping, just by the luck of the draw.
Yes.
They're going to. And I used to go to 3rd and 4th rounds and finally decided that was not a good use of my time.
Yes.
That it was better to say you've got to be. But they're still sort of stuck in that idea. I don't know if there's any solution to that.
The solution is to figure out why that's happening, and then to try to address it. If students are not responding in ways that you want or in ways that you think you understand, the best thing to do, I think, is ask them. So I would first seek to get information from my students about why they are not taking more effective steps to improve their performance here. And there are a number of ways to do this. In a small class where there's a lot of trust, you may just be able to bring it up in the class there. What some teachers do is to ask the class to appoint an advisory committee to the professor, which operates all semester long, or if a special problem comes up and you haven't got one, you can ask for one at that point. And those folks sit down with you for a few minutes after class or at some time. Don't bring them into your office, my suggestion. Take them to a coffee shop, meet them someplace, and just say to them, look, what's happening in this course? How does it appear to you? What's helpful about it? What do you think I can change? What do you think you can change? What you're trying to do is to get you and the students on the same team, aiming for the same goal, which is that they will learn. Another way to do it, of course, is by questionnaire in your classroom, and I am constantly querying my students. I am about to meet this coming Tuesday for the second time of the semester with my students. The first time that we met, I broke them up into small groups and had them exchange responses about the pieces of literature that we had read. I'm sorry. there was an introductory class session, so this is really the third. In the second class session, we discussed readings, and I did it by breaking them up into small groups. Now, this third time that we meet, I will already begin querying them. I'll have a little question to them, and I'll say, if you could just take a piece of scratch paper for me and write how it seemed to you last time when we broke up into the small groups. Was that helpful? Was it not helpful? Would you suggest some changes in the way I'm managing it? Just give me some feedback on that. And I will use that to plan how I work small groups in the future. So that there's scarcely a 2-week period that goes by in which I'm not gathering some information from my students about how things are going. Consequently, the responses at the end of the semester, your student evaluations should never be a surprise. There should be no surprises for you there. Because you should have been right on top of that information all along. Student evaluations are sometimes intimidating to faculty who wish to change, especially because we know that our students' primary educational experience is in the lecture method, and that sometimes they don't react well to changes. The thing is, if you look at the research data on student evaluations, you probably have in your student evaluation form here what's called a global question that asks the students overall, how was this course, right? Okay. What correlates, you tell me, what correlates with the global question?
Expected grade.
Yes. Students' expected grade in the class correlates. So the higher the grade they expect, the better they'll give it to you. Now, there are a couple ways to interpret that. One is that if you give higher grades, your course evaluations will rise. Turns out that is not the most logical or defensible explanation of that correlation. The most probable and defensible explanation of that correlation is that students who learn well respond by rewarding the class with a good, they like the class. They learned well, they know it, and by the way, there is a correlation between what students think they learned and what external measures indicate that they did learn. So in some sense, not perfectly, but in some sense, they do know whether they're learning or not. And the best explanation of that correspondence, according to the research literature and the people that have written about this, is that the students who learn well like the class, and they reward it with a good evaluation. Or that there are some underlying factors that enhance both learning and appreciation of the class. There is no correlation, no significant correlation between how difficult the students think the class is and the global rating. That's important. There is no correlation between how difficult they think it is and the global rating. There's a frequent faculty myth that if the class is too hard, your evaluations will suffer. The research literature does not support that. In fact, there is a small but not statistically significant positive correlation. What else correlates with high student global evaluations? Anybody know this literature? The teacher is clear, high correlation. The course is well organized, high correlation. Those, in most things that you read, those are the highest, clear and well organized. The teacher is accessible, various kind of, the teacher gave good help, the teacher was available outside of class, the teacher gave useful response on my papers, those kinds of questions. So availability and helpfulness. Teacher enthusiasm for the subject. There's a strong correlation there. So what are our students rewarding? They are rewarding our clarity and organization, our availability and helpfulness, and our enthusiasm for the topic. Now, I think those are fine things for students to reward. And I think that what happens is sometimes when we move to these more interactive ways of doing class, we ourselves are often experimenting with something we haven't been taught, or haven't used before, and it's a skill. It takes a while to get the hang of doing this well. Like as I was saying earlier, when I first started using student groups interactively, it would often not be successful. It would come across to my students as not clear and not well organized. And I think that's where we sometimes get slammed in the short term for trying this stuff. But let me tell you, the potential of these methods for high student evaluations is very great. If you can learn how to do it well, you have a tremendous potential to have your students absolutely love it. Do you know Craig Nelson, the biologist from Indiana University, who goes around doing workshops on critical thinking? He has won a number of teaching awards, both in his department and university-wide at Indiana University Bloomington. He says that he was just an ordinary teacher before he started using interactive methods, even in large classes. And now he's gotten all these awards, and he attributes it to his having learned how to make these new interactive methods work. I mean, in even large classes, he has first-year students in Bio 101 reading biological literature and gathering together in small groups to discuss this stuff and working interactively in lots and lots of ways. Questions, comments? Okay. I want to now, I want to do two more things. I want to kind of wind up and give you a chance to apply all this stuff we've had about class time by inviting you to turn to one or two people near you and talk about one way that you could move first exposure into student alone time and process and response into class time. Just think about one way that you might be able to do this for your own teaching, for one of your own courses, and share it with one or two other people. Then I want to go back to the issue of criteria for grading, how to establish the actual grading process itself, which for a workshop on grading, I think we haven't yet spent enough time on the actual grading process. So when you have a stack of papers in front of you, or when you're thinking about assigning papers, how do you establish fair criteria, and how do you apply them, and how do you respond effectively to students? Sound okay? Okay. I would invite you then to turn to a couple of neighbors, move around the room if there's somebody in your discipline that you especially want to talk to, and share with one another. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes for this. Share with one another one way in the class that you are thinking about today, one way in which you might be able to move first exposure into student alone time and process and response into the class time. Okay? You have about 10 minutes. Do it. Pretty good at getting class discussion going, but it's going to be such hard sledding. And most of the students in there are going to want to handle this course by taking good notes in class from my lecture, reading Cliff's notes, not the play, and then taking the test and doing the paper out of library sources. And nobody's going to learn much, and I'm going to have a miserable time. And think of all the hours that will go into this, and my life is too short for this. I do not want to do this. So what I did was to purchase lectures on Shakespeare's plays, videotaped. And each week, I required my students to see 2 taped lectures on their student alone time. And then I divided the class into 6 groups of 15 students each. And I met once a week with each group. So that what they did each week, what a student did, Donna did, was to see 2 videotaped lectures, read the play, of course, and anything else, prepare a writing assignment, and then bring her notes from watching the videos, her notes from the play, and her writing assignment to class once a week with me in a small room in a circle with 14 other students and me. What I did was to facilitate 6 of those discussions each week. Rather than preparing and giving 3 lectures on Shakespeare to classes of 90, I instead prepared for and facilitated 6 discussion groups with a changing body of students each time, but over the same play. Got it? Logistically, you got it? What happened was that my students loved it, absolutely loved it. every student virtually spoke every week. And virtually every student wrote something every week. And I spent, on the average, an hour less per week than I otherwise would have. Let me draw that out for you. And the students, by the way, spent more time, which is good. You know how much time students spend out of class on all their outside class work per week? What does the literature say? Anybody know what the research says about that? 5 to 8 hours at your type of institution, friends. 5 to 8 hours per week, not per class, but for all classes combined on out-of-school work. That's what they're spending at your kind of institution. Small liberal arts colleges do a little bit better, but not that much. Harvard does a little bit better, but not that much. And nobody's getting more than 12 hours per week out of their students for all outside of class work. I got that work out of my students. And I think that this method helps us to increase student out-of-class time. Here was my time. I'm also concerned about my out-of-class time, right? In the old way, I had 3 hours to give the lectures. Now, let's presume I know the plays, right? I know my material. 6 hours preparing those lectures, let's say 2 hours each. And when I get done with this 9 hours, I have not yet looked at a single piece of student writing. And I have probably exchanged conversation with less than a third of my students. So, no writing, limited talk. This is the new method. I spend 6 hours in discussion groups, but they're all repeats of the same thing. So there's one prep to do this thing 6 times. And the prep consists not of preparing a lecture, but of making 2 decisions. One decision is, what's the writing assignment going to be? And the other decision is, how am I going to launch the class, and what are the main things that I want to make sure get done in that class? Now, that doesn't take me a lot of time. That takes me maybe an hour. So 1 hour prep.
Do you not view the videotapes of the lecture?
Yes. I do view the videotapes of the lecture. The first time I used this method, I had to view all the videotapes and choose them. So there was that upfront time. Once I've done that, however, then now I have excellent notes of those videos, so I just go over the notes. Thank you. Let's say now half an hour reviewing videotape notes. And of course, no matter what I'm doing, I'm rereading the plays on a regular schedule and keeping up with the literature and stuff like that. All right, then, where am I? Okay, and then I spend maybe half an hour giving credit for the writing. I have less time involved than I did in the old way. But what I'm achieving here with the new way is that virtually all students in a given week write something and get response in the discussion group. Because again, the writing assignments are the basis of the discussion group. And virtually all students talk. It worked wonderfully.
When are the writing assignments given? I don't see how to follow that.
In the syllabus at the beginning of the semester.
And then so they prepare them in advance?
Ahead of time, yes. So when you come into the discussion, let's say your discussion group is on Wednesday, and it's on the Merchant of Venice. And you have already then, by then, since last Wednesday, when your group last met, you have watched 2 tapes on Merchant of Venice, and you have read the play, of course, and you have read whatever else I ask you to read, and you bring the notes from those things with you into class, and you have written an assignment in which I ask you to take a position on the interpretation of Shylock in that play. He's the Jew, remember? And you can see him as a total villain whose Jewishness is simply intended by Shakespeare to enhance his evilness, or you can see him as a somewhat sympathetic character. And I ask you to take a position on that issue and then to list 3 pieces of evidence from the play that would support your position. We come into class. I say, what's your name? Jim. I say, Jim, what position did you take? And you say, well, I took the Shylock as total villain approach. So I say, okay, would you go up and write your position on the board and put your 3 pieces of evidence now down? Now, who else took that position? So maybe three other people took your position. So I have them go up to the board and help you. And you get all the pieces of evidence down that any of you have. And that's part of the board. I say, now, who else had a different position? Okay, somebody else does. Ruth does, let's say. So she goes up, and her companions go up and help her. And then we start doing, and then we look at these, and we add evidence, and we talk about the strength of evidence, and then we start counter-argument. And we start drawing arrows, because it turns out that the counter-argument to this position on Shylock is over here as argument for this position on Shylock. And by the time we have finished that class, the class has constructed a complex argument for and against Shylock. Now, some of them may choose to pick that up and write a paper for that for their midterm essay. So that's how the class works.
In your old method there, you had 3 hours per lecture. That block of time is divided by the university that this is like this. In your discussion groups, you still use that same block of time, or you created too many blocks that you can use that same?
Right. Here's what I did. First of all, I went to my department head. I told him what I was doing. If he had not been supportive, I would not have done this. I also checked with some of the key people in the English department and with the director of undergraduate studies, because I wanted them all to understand what I was doing and to be at least reasonable, and at least be willing for me to try this. Then I did use, for 3 of the groups, the regularly scheduled class time, which was 8 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I had asked for that time, because I wanted to create gratitude in my class when I allowed half of them to meet at other times. And I got it. I got very high student evaluations from this course, by the way. They just loved it. So what I did was to say, look, here are 6 times, and I wrote them on the overhead. I said, now check at your desk here, write down all the times when you can meet. All of them could meet for the regularly scheduled class time. A number of them could meet for some of the other times. There was a Tuesday 4 p.m. group. There was this group or that group. Those groups had been established by me in consultation with my registrar. I asked my registrar, I sent my registrar 6 or 7 different times, and I said, during which of these times can you provide me a room for at least 15 people? And she sent back and said, well, I can provide you a room for these 4 times, but not for these 2. So out of the 4, I chose 3, and then I had my room, right? Now, if everybody did this, the registrars of the world would all quit. But because only a few of us are experimenting in this way, it was manageable. So now I had my 3 extra rooms, and I got my students signed up. I told them, if you can come in any of the non-scheduled times, do that, and leave the scheduled times for those who can't come in any of the other times. And my students did arrange themselves pretty evenly in that way. And then the tapes I put in the media center, and I announced specific times when they would be shown. Like every Tuesday and Thursday night from 7 to 9, both tapes for that week would be shown. You could always go on Tuesday or Thursday, see both the tapes, boom, and other times as well. And then in between the public showings, which were carried on in a large viewing room for 25 people in the media center, in between, students could independently check the tapes out and use them in the viewing carols in the media center. There are individual carols there, and there are carols for 4. So that worked. The other thing that I did, in 3 cases with the videos, I was able to get permission without spending a whole lot of money to broadcast it on the campus cable network. Now, you can even put it on cable at 2 a.m. because students can set their VCRs, and they make copies. And then those copies, you know, I'm going to turn this thing off. Those copies circulate among the students, right? So that's a way to get more copies out there and to make it a little easier for them to see this stuff. Okay.
Material that wasn't already on lecture, because I mean,
Mhm.
part of the thing that you're saying, that it seems to me that if you're in a Shakespeare class, it's pretty well assumed
That's right.
there's been a wealth of material out there, but I mean, it's just from my experience, a
Mhm.
lot of the kind of stuff that I'm teaching is going to be new stuff,
Mhm.
or, kind of adding new stuff to the canon, et cetera.
Right,
And
right.
I wanted, I wonder about what you do about the kind of
Mhm.
material that
Mhm.
you're
Mhm. You either have to make them yourself or you have to purchase them. And this system of mine, I think, works best in fields where scholarship, at least perhaps at the intro course level, changes more slowly than every year. So, but it even works for Howard, because how you solve basic physics problems in Physics 101 doesn't change all that rapidly. So Howard the physicist made all these tapes of himself demonstrating and solving physics problems. Now he just uses them. He assigns them every semester. Think of the time that's saved. I mean, this is what's going to happen to us in higher education, right? It's coming, folks. Eventually, the top 3 physics teachers in the nation are going to have tapes on the web, are going to have lectures on the web, or in some other dispensable way. It's like the book. It's like the book. Remember, folks used to teach when there were no books, right? And then all of a sudden, the book, something that somebody else had written, could now be incorporated as a major portion of your class. You did not, like Socrates, have to say everything in the class. There's another revolution coming, and that is that the web and the videotape and so on are also going to be now media which we can incorporate, in which other people besides ourselves talk to our students and give them information. And believe me, my colleagues in the English department at Cincinnati, some of them were very excited about this idea. Some of them were deeply suspicious and quite upset that I was doing this. And I don't think they were unusual. I think this would happen in any English department in the country. Because they said, you're running us out of a job. You're letting them replace us with a tape. And I said to them, if you can be replaced by a tape, you will be. The history of the Industrial Revolution is that when there's a technological advance that saves labor, labor itself will not be able to stand. The Luddites learned this, right? You can smash the machines, but you cannot stop the Industrial Revolution. If we are spending all our time lecturing first exposure material in the classroom, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it can be done by media better than we can do it. These Shakespeare lectures were marvelous. They have clips there from old play performances. First you see Gielgud as Hamlet, and then you see somebody else as Hamlet, and then someone intelligently compares the both of them. I mean, by the time I got those clips off the web and put them all together, plus I have to learn Photoshop first, right? And then I put these clips together and I make up, buy it, show it, right? Then what I spent all my time doing is stuff that no tape and no medium and no computer can replace. My sitting with 15 of my students and looking them in the eye and having a really good discussion based on the tapes. That's what made it worthwhile to me. Okay, let's take a look at criteria for evaluation. We looked at Jack's sheet on page, what was it, page 3? Yeah. Page 3. I want to set us up for classrooms. I also want to set up the afternoon a little bit by suggesting that one of the ways in which we need to make our classroom procedures more understandable to various publics is by being clear to ourselves, to our students, and potentially to other audiences what our criteria are for grades. This sheet is one professor's start at trying to explain what the criteria are for the work that he asks in the classroom. there's a system that teachers can use to kind of force you to state your criteria in excruciating clarity and detail. And I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes just showing you what that system is. It's called primary trait analysis, PTA. It has been used nationally to assess United States students on the assessment of educational progress, which is given to U.S. students, as some of you know, in, I think, 4th, 7th, and 11th grades, and has been given for several decades. So you have all these school kids writing stuff, and people needed to figure out a way in which they could be assessed. That's a little background on the terminology. I think the term is bad, but that's what it's called. All right, what is this? This is a system of making you be really, really clear about what you want. Now, let's imagine that you have in a plate on your table there 3 different kinds of chocolate chip cookies. Imagining this? It's almost lunchtime. This is a good example. 3 chocolate chip cookies, different brands. How are you going to assess, how are you going to give grades to those chocolate chip cookies? In the primary trait assessment plan, the first thing that you do is to decide on the traits that will count. When you are judging chocolate chip cookies, what counts? Number of chips. Yes. What else? Texture. Size. Taste. Right. Those are traits. They are nouns or noun phrases. Now what you do is, for each of those traits, you create a scale. It can be a 2-point, 3-point, 5-point, I don't care, 17-point scale in which you describe the performance. So a number 3 in terms of number of chocolate chips might be what? Take a piece of scratch paper. You have 30 seconds. What's a number 3 for chocolate chips? Highest scoring performance for number of chocolate chips. Highest scoring performance for number of chocolate chips. Okay, what'd you have? How many of you had to change how this was phrased? You do, don't you? Because you cannot specifically describe a high-scoring cookie in terms of number of chocolate chips because you don't know how big the chips are and how big the cookie is, right? So you have to change the name of this thing to something like percentage of, or percentage of chocolate, right? Percentage or ratio, better yet here, ratio of chocolate to dough. One of the lessons, then, about using this strategy is that it forces you to be very specific about what you want. Let's take a look at a scientific experiment. One teacher's strategy for explaining the qualities that she wants in a scientific experiment. And that is on page 30. This teacher is teaching us a senior capstone course in biology. The assignment, and I talked about it way at the beginning of the workshop, the single major assignment, there are other smaller ones, but the single major assignment is to conduct an original scientific experiment and to write it up in scientific report format. This teacher had a number of traits for her criteria. What would they be for a scientific experiment? Title is this one. What else would she care about? Experimental design. Drawing conclusions. Graphing data. Methods. Controlling variables. Operational definitions. Those were some of the traits Now, under each trait, she then makes a scale. And this is the scale for title on page 30. It's a 5-point scale in this case. You can use as many points as you want. Get the idea how these things are built? All right, now if you'll turn earlier in the salmon handout, I have shown you a whole bunch of primary trait scales. On pages 7 and 8, some basic explanation of how to construct one of these babies. Page 9 and 10 is one for a statistics class. These are done by actual teachers, not by me. 9 and 10 is one for a statistics class. 3 traits, page 10, methodology, data analysis, conclusions. Page 11, office management, a spreadsheet project. Page 14, a very simple one, journals in a Spanish class. Page 15 and 16, an art history assignment. And then I've got one for career planning, one for nursing, begins on page 19, psychiatric nursing, one for a group project in management, page 24. These are not just for writing. These are for clinical behaviors, business behaviors. And then on page 27, is the total one for the biology class with all the traits on it. Now I have 30 seconds left, so I'm going to make the main point about these things. This is a way to make public the criteria on which grades are based, and to have a group of people use a common format to express the criteria they are using in the classroom. When we come back this afternoon, this is where we'll start. We'll start with ways in which classroom assessment can be written down and explicated for external audiences, including other members of the department, accreditation agencies, legislatures, board members, employers, whoever. Ways in which the stealth assessment that we've been doing all along in our classrooms now can be shared, because it must be shared, with new publics in new ways, but with still the control remaining in faculty hands. I started out this morning saying I'm a faculty member. I come to assessment as a faculty member. To me, it's happening in the classroom. And it's on classroom assessment, faculty-controlled assessment, that we have to build departmental and gen ed assessment. Thanks, folks. Don't forget to come back at 1 o'clock if you wish. And thanks a lot for being here this morning.